Welcome everyone to another episode of Psyched, and Andrea Chu is here with me. And today we've got a fantastic episode. We're going to talk a little bit about social isolation. We're going to talk about the loneliness experiment, and loneliness is a very interesting concept. It matters. It does. It really does matter. I think a lot of people today are losing that social connection, and sometimes it's not necessarily loss of social connection. It's just that the social connections that people want actually don't match up to their actual experience of the relationship with others. And we're seeing a lot of that. Andrea, tease us up with what we're going to talk about today.
All right, so we're going to talk about something that a lot of people dare not talk about. I think there's this stigma that goes around. If you're saying that you're lonely above or below or anywhere else, then you are weak. You are, pretty much a complainer, right? These are things that you often hear. So welcome everybody. We're going to talk about loneliness, and we're going to dive a bit deeper into something called executive loneliness, which is something I've not really heard of until recently. And we have an exciting guest, which I'll introduce to you in a bit. But first, we want to show you an exciting experiment that BBC did in 2018. And this was the largest experiment that they have done so far. And let's have a look at what that experiment is.
55,000 people took part in the BBC's loneliness experiment, making it the largest in the world, and now we can reveal the results. There's often a stereotype that loneliness strikes older, isolated people, and of course it can. But we found that on average, younger people are even lonelier. 40% of 16 to 24-year-olds who took part told us they often or very often feel lonely, compared with 27% of over 75s. We also found that people of all ages who feel discriminated against for any reason, for their sexuality perhaps, or because of a disability, are more likely to feel lonely. The good news for people of any age who feel lonely is that you score higher than average for empathy. The sad news is that people who feel lonely told us they feel ashamed about it. Only a third believe that loneliness is about being on your own. It's more about feeling disconnected from the world and not having anyone who you feel really understands you. Those who score high on loneliness do seem to have lower levels of trust in others and higher levels of anxiety, which might make it harder to form friendships. But when it comes to a test of recognising emotions in others, their social skills are in fact just as good as everyone else's. People who say they often feel lonely have poorer health on average and are more likely to smoke. We also asked about social media and found that people who report high levels of loneliness tend to have more Facebook friends who they only know online. Maybe if we feel lonely, we look online for the meaningful friendships we don't have in real life. So what's the answer? We asked you which solutions have worked for you in alleviating loneliness. At number 1 was distracting yourself by dedicating time to work, study or hobbies. Next was joining a social club, but this also appeared in the list of the top 3 unhelpful things that other people suggest, so it's not going to work for everyone. At number 3 was changing the way you think. This is easier said than done, but there are psychological strategies which could help us to find more trust in others. The next suggestions you gave us were to start a conversation with anyone, to talk to friends and family about your feelings, and to look for the good in every person you meet. Different solutions will work for different people. What we have shown is that loneliness matters and affects nearly all of us at some time, and that most people, but by no means all, have found ways out of it.
All right, Andrea, loneliness, right? And as I was listening to that clip from BBC, a couple of things I think we talked about in the past. We talked about anxiety, fear, shame, and this whole helplessness, right, or powerlessness, and I think Martin Seligman calls this learned helplessness, right? And many of these emotions actually drive or influence how we act, and it creates this downward spiral where loneliness actually causes people to withdraw even further from family and friends and become even more lonely. And it's very interesting that not many people talk about it, and I think we're very honored. And I read the book written by Nick Jonsson, Executive Loneliness, and we've got Nick who'll be joining us. He's going to tell us a bit about his story of that spiral, right? Of how you move away from having all these friends. As the video said, you have so many friends on Facebook and so on. But you still can be lonely. Tell us a bit about Nick and what he will be sharing with us, Andrea.
All right, so we have Nick Jonsson. He is the co-founder and managing director at EGN, which is standing for Executives Global Network in Singapore, which is the largest Asian confidential peer network for the C-suite and entrepreneurs. And he's also a global keynote speaker and a lot of other things you can see on his LinkedIn. He does a lot of charity work, he writes books, and one of his number one international best-selling book is called The Executive Loneliness, which Roshan spoke about, and he wrote about this as well. And it talks about how to avoid the next epidemic in mental health that causes isolation, stress, anxiety in the modern business world that no one talks about. And I really agree, right? Nobody talks about this, especially in workplaces. We talk about it personally, but we don't talk about it in terms of professional loneliness. And that's something that's very interesting. So let's welcome Nick as he joined us today, and let's talk about some of the thoughts he has on this topic.
So Nick, welcome to our show, and super glad to have you with us. And Nick, I read your book, Executive Loneliness, and I read your story in the book of how your sort of life dovetailed, and was somewhat very over a period of time, I guess, changed drastically. Talk us through that experience and what happened to you, and maybe a little bit on how you ultimately overcame what you define as executive loneliness.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to the show. And yeah, it's my pleasure to speak about that. And, most people wouldn't share about their personal story, especially not on a show like this and in a workplace, as we will talk about today. But what I learned is that once you become vulnerable and you do share your story, the feelings and the rewards with that is that you feel connected and you escape all the loneliness. So let me share with you my story very briefly. So over a few years, I achieved very high, and I was really looking for my career progressing. I moved from one role to a bigger role to a bigger role, more responsibility. Everything looked fantastic on the CV, on the LinkedIn profile. I won awards and everything else. But behind the scene, I was suffering. I was driving by myself and just trying to show everyone else, including my family, friends, and colleagues, that I could do it. And this probably ring true for many high achievers. But behind the scenes, then I actually felt lonely. I didn't know what purpose. Why was I working so hard? One day blended over to another, and I didn't speak to anyone how I was feeling. I thought this must just be the case how everyone is feeling. And that is basically when I eventually hit the crash, when I didn't realize, why am I working here day and night for this company? What's the purpose? Why am I going to job? Is it for the paycheck only, or is it some reason behind it? So that's a little bit sharing about my story.
All right, and I think that's amazing, right, for you to share that story and to write about it and to also help the others who may be suffering as you have suffered, and hopefully that brings a lot of awareness. And in your book, you talk about the 5 pathways, which we'll dive deeper into it. But let's keep it to a later part of the segment. But I think going back to the experiment on BBC, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can certainly resonate a lot of things with it, and they're talking about young people feeling lonely. And the fact is that also in my book, where I'm looking at the executives feel lonely. And what is it then we have in common? Let's compare the young people with the executives for a moment. Why are they feeling lonely? Is it that they're spending time just by themselves? No, that's not about loneliness. It means that if you're among your friends or among your family, or you're inside your office, but you don't feel that someone is listening to you, you don't feel heard, perhaps no one understands you, then you can feel lonely. And that's what I mean with executive loneliness, especially here. And I looked in Singapore, where Singapore is this regional hub where you have many senior executives in senior positions. They will have a boss, perhaps in the US or Europe, who they're reporting to, and they are responsible perhaps for Asia. So they're sitting in Singapore, and they have no one else at their level. So they're in Singapore, who they can go for a lunch break, who they can have a conversation with. And that is why it can be extremely lonely to be, especially in a high position. They say it's lonely at the top, and it really is like that. The higher you go, you think that you're being rewarded with a bigger paycheck, but you have to be aware that also it becomes very lonely the higher you go.
And Nick, in your book, you say that there are a lot of coping mechanisms that people try, and many of it you reference to is as not effective. maybe you can share a little bit on what some of those ineffective coping mechanisms. I think there's a lot of gurus out there, spouting a lot of so-called half truths. What were some of them? Because I know you mentioned a couple of them in the books, and also what was the way that enabled you to get out of this whole issue that you had?
Well, let's first share what is definitely not working and what many people go for, especially if you're a busy senior executive, you're working late, maybe you come home and you feel very burnt out and you feel stressed. Well, it's easy to pour a glass of wine or a whiskey and start using alcohol to calm down. And that's what happened to me. And that became very quickly a very, very bad habit. And before I knew it, I started to lose my fitness. And instead of going for a run, I said I would go to the bar and have some beers, and that would calm me down for the moment. But of course, the next morning, the problems will still be there, and I will feel drowsy as well. So all those things is something that is definitely unhealthy. Other things may be to go on social media, to spend too much time on social media, which is also something that can be very stressful and become addictive as well. And then you're also losing touch with the real people that you're supposed to be with. So those were some of the things that really dragged me down. And I'm sharing this also in my book. What happened, it was really that I had bad habits, and with the bad habits came bad company, and I really had to do a reset, and that only came from me falling very sick before I managed to climb back. So what I'm hoping with and the purpose of my book is that it should be do personal inventory, and that's my first step, where you look at yourself, that what is it that is not right in your life. Do you have real connection, or are all your friends on social media? Are you drinking alcohol? Are you overweight, for example? All of these matters, and take an inventory, just like a shopkeeper will write a list once a year to see what is going on with a business. Do that with yourself and look at that and address it. And that was the first step of my book, basically, to take in your own inventory, to take stock.
Right, and I have a very cheeky question, if you if you don't mind me asking. So we talk a lot about in even the BBC experiment says that people who are a lot on social media have a lot of friends. They are trying to look for a compensation in a way, right? Because in real life we don't really have either family or friends that can support you. But I mean, there will be communities that will be arguing with you. It says that social media still is a community. Like for example, if you have a specific hobby online, you talk about it, you join clubhouses, you do all these things. Does that affect that kind of loneliness? Or is it really, really very different from, real life sort of interactions and connections?
That's a great question, and indeed, and it varies on social media. What club you are joining? Is it a big club with 10,000 people where people are trying to show off, or is it a small little community where you might have breakout rooms where you're 10 people who have a meaningful conversation? Perhaps the conversation is moderated, there's a facilitator, and you're really having that genuine connection. Then I would say it has its place, and it's definitely beneficial, especially if we're looking back now during the pandemic times, and even today in some countries you cannot meet socially 10 15 people, for example. So many of the support groups, including where I'm a volunteer, during the circuit breakers and things that we had in Singapore, these have moved online, and we have had confidential meetings and support group meetings online, and they have been wonderful. And in that sense, media can play a very useful part in this, and just the fact that our event today is on social media, which is wonderful.
Okay, and I have something else before Roshan jumps in. I know, sorry, Roshan, but I have something else to ask as well. So, I mean, on the BBC experiment as well, it says that people feel ashamed about feeling lonely. There's a lot of shame that comes with this loneliness. The first question I would ask you is, during your time when you had this loneliness, did you feel ashamed in it hinders you from having that connection with other people, like talking to your family and friends? And it comes down to that second step in your book, right? Asking for help. And this is also another question from the comment section. It says that it's so refreshing to hear you talk about this so openly, Nick. For people who have not reached that level of comfort to talk to someone about it, what advice would you give them? So yes, three questions in one, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, the stigma is huge here around mental health. I mean, we don't mind to go to the doctor if we break our arm, but if we believe that we have a burnout or some anxiety attacks or something, we are very scared to go and see a doctor. And in fact, I did a survey of that among senior executives in Singapore, and 84% of these said that they would not talk about it in the company. And 75% of these also wouldn't seek help for it. So that means that they would not talk about it, they wouldn't seek professional help about it. And that is where I found myself in as well. I didn't know where to turn to, I didn't know who to speak to. I was worried that if I go to see a therapist or a counselor, who will see me when I walk in there to this address, and maybe if I sign up, I'll be part of some computer system and people will know that I'm there. Would I be blacklisted from jobs in the future? All of these things were popping in my head, and that's is what I'm hearing from others also. So people are very reluctant to seek help and to talk about it. And in my case, it was a matter of life and death. I became so sick that I just had to ask for help. I had to go and see doctors because I was just unwell, and that's where it started. And as soon as I opened up, and I just told my wife, who I just married at the time, and I told the doctor what was happening to me and how I felt, I started my recovery already by just speaking up because I had held it inside me for a few years by then, and just the release by just speaking out, to some other people. And immediately, of course, my wife then, who was surprised to hear all of this because I had covered for it so well, she started to, of course, helping me and guiding me. And the next step I did then was to join an anonymous mental health support group. And in my book and on my website also, you have a list of support hotlines and so on. And the most of these are free. The most are free hotlines and so on, useful tools which people can actually dial in if they're not feeling well. So you can do it anonymously. And the beautiful thing these days is also that even a therapist, a counselor, you can have a Zoom session with them one-on-one. So you don't have to that worry that we had before the pandemic that you have to go to the location. So I think there's been a tremendous change in the last year. And also the fact that we are speaking about this today is just wonderful, because we're all helping out to remove the stigma around this conversation. So my advice to any listener is, don't hold back, use the hotlines, use the and call, and yes, ask for help, as is my second step of my book.
And speaking of your book, it's available. Executive Loneliness. It's available almost at all major book outlets, right, from Amazon to bookstores and so on and so forth. And one of the things I enjoyed, in your book was, when you talk about the path to how you got to that space, right? I think many of us don't realize that it's a slow process that takes you down that path. And because it's a slow process, we sort of miss the signs. And if you can share with us, I mean, for others, I think that many people may be somewhat going down the same path. What would be some signs that you can sort of know now, looking back on hindsight, that would alert you to say, hey, you may be down that same path that you went through, or the path of executive loneliness. I know one is definitely what you spoke about just now. As leaders, you have the whole Asia Pacific, or you may have success. You need to drive success for your organization, and that may somewhat, the pressure of that may somewhat be overwhelming. But are there other signs that sort of maybe indicators to us that we too may be down that path if we're not too careful about it?
Yes, sure. And I mean, what you can look out for in yourself or perhaps the family members or colleagues are things such as sleep patterns. If you suddenly don't sleep, you look tired, or gaining or losing weight. So in my case, I actually gained more than 25 kilos. I stopped exercising, which was a big part of my life and in my DNA was to exercise. Suddenly I lost the interest in that. So perhaps also if you see a mother who's losing interest in their own baby, or if you are with a partner who every single morning have made breakfast for you all their life, suddenly they stop that. So it's that extreme sort of switch in pattern, starting something, stopping something. perhaps also look out for if some of your friends are exiting all the groups. If you have friends where you have WhatsApp groups, suddenly they just exit everything. It could be that they want to take a break from social media, so you better check in with them why. But it could also be that they just want to self-isolate. And of course, during the pandemic times, it's even harder to know what's the reason for people isolating, because for many times it's been the right thing to do, to work from home, to stay at home, to keep our society safe. But we need to be very mindful of our close friends and look out for them. Are they isolating because of that, or what's the real reason? So that's some things that I can recommend to look out for. And of course, in my case also, it was consuming alcohol, for example, which became a big problem for me. But as with everything, we executives at that time, we tried to hide it our best and find an excuse for everything. So I made it all around, it's company events, it's this, it's that, but it was all lies. It was just to serve myself, and it was all poor excuses.
And the other piece, we've got a question from Esther, but the other piece I think that's interesting that Esther brings up is that, in spite, you may be going through this, but you still have responsibilities. You still have to drive the business forward. You still have success. You still have to make the changes or the pivots that need to happen. All the different contextual things that constantly nag a business. And I think Esther's questions is something related. You may have your personal struggles, but you also have to balance that with the executive challenges that you have as a leader, and the leadership responsibilities that you have. And how do you balance that? How do you maintain that? And I think specifically she's talking about a workplace context in here.
Yes, and I think there's a difference between a work relationship, friendship, and being vulnerable. Let me give you an example from the book. So one of the ladies, a Singaporean lady who I interviewed for the book, she's working for many years as a senior executive and managing director in a big company. She has a quite big team below her. She's in a man's business, that most of her colleagues are men. All her working life, she had to learn to be pretty tough, and sometimes she had to step on people to make her way. But she's up there. She made it. She has a beautiful apartment. She has a car. Both her children have their own nanny. On the outside, it looks like the perfect relationship, but she felt lost inside. She felt lonely going to her work, and by feeling lonely at work, when she came home, she also felt isolated from the husband. She didn't have the connection and happiness in herself. And it went as far as she actually started thinking about her own suicide. And when I interviewed her for the book, she told me that she even rehearsed her own suicide twice. That means that she had been to the location and seen everything, and she really was thinking about it. Luckily, at this time, she was seeing a therapist, and she decided to tell him. And the first thing he did immediately was to call the husband, and the husband came, and they had a conversation, all three of them. And they, just by then she mentioning it again, just like what happened in my case, she started a recovery. Everything fell to bits and pieces. She felt, oh, the therapist understand me. Listen, the husband, of course, understand me subtly and listened and showed care, gave her space, and so on. So everything just changed so quickly. And what happened now during the pandemic, her team in the company, she decided to give a copy of my book to each of the team members, even her boss. And she asked them all, can you please read the book, and let's then have a session where we discuss it. And they all read it. And when she called a meeting, they didn't know that it was her story in the book, but she told them all, and they were completely shocked. Here were the boss, the colleague, the managing director, this super successful lady admitting to being so vulnerable in front of them. And it changed everything in her office. And now going through the pandemic, they've had a wonderful team spirit between them. And she even told me that her boss even came in to her one day in the office and sharing his personal story and saying that he also was going through some difficult times. And they had never ever had these transparent, open, honest, deep conversations before in her team. And I don't know if that is not being a friendship. That means that you still show respect for each other, but you are open, you're sharing when you're going through a difficult time. And by doing that, there will be no loneliness in her team, I can assure you that.
Fantastic. And I think there's one more comment from a guest who says sometimes the hardest part, the first step of acknowledging and admitting that you need help is the hardest part. And how did you, I mean, for yourself, how did you reach that point where you ended up reaching out for help? Because it is probably the hardest part, right? Acknowledging it and then reaching out for help.
Yes, indeed, and that is the difference between life and death. Because if you look at people who sadly go all the way to do suicide, they must have been at that stage, that they decide to not ask for help and they go worse, 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 worse. In my case, I didn't go that far. I didn't have suicidal thoughts, but I could feel and I knew that I was dying because I was drinking too much alcohol. I was too unfit. My blood pressure was going through the roof. Blood values was really bad when I went to the doctor, and if this was going on much longer, I wouldn't have been around today. So that was an alarm bell for me. It was a warning signal. And I just remember when lying there in my bed in 2018 and looking and thinking about myself, and I felt my heart was running so fast that it was going to jump out of me. And my left foot at that time had become swollen also. And I later heard that this was due to the psychosomatic effect by basically being under so much stress and so much tension that it even started to show up outside my body. So that was when I realized, well, if I don't seek help now, then then what is going to happen to me? So I was fearful for my life. I even wrote my will, my testament at that stage because I thought I was going to go. But when I had done that, that's when I decided then to tell my wife, and she helped me to go to a doctor. And from there on, I decided to really, really take action.
Oh, that's great. One other question from a guest. How can leaders help the employees who are struggling with loneliness? I think, yeah, I mean, on the leadership side, I think we have many employees actually that are going through this period of social isolation and are struggling, right? So how do we help them?
I would say the example I explained about the senior executive, the woman, is a perfect example. She dared to be vulnerable first. You cannot, as a leader, expect that your team, who are perhaps reporting to you, that they will come in and be vulnerable to you unless you've been vulnerable with them. So you can do everything from having perhaps a one-on-one coffee first with your team, getting to know them a bit. And again, you don't have to build a strong, deep friendship just because you're having an honest conversation. I mean, let's admit it. We know we're in a pandemic. There's been challenging times. There's never a better time for a senior executive to open up and share something personal. They can share about some of their struggles working from home together with the children, or they can share a story. They must have something on their mind, share something that they've gone through that was difficult and how they dealt with it. And by setting that scene first, then next time it can be the employees' turn to discuss. So yeah, I would say that it has to start from the top of the organization and downwards, and lead by example.
Yep. And another comment on the stigma, right? I think there is always that fear admitting you need help. Even when you get better, there will be always that stigma attached to you. And I think that and it may affect your credibility. But I think in the case of point in your case, right, it actually ended up being a positive for you, right? I mean, when you started telling your story, I mean, ultimately you became a best-selling author and so on. So there's some merits to it, I think, right? Of being vulnerable, of being authentic, right? I think ultimately people look for authenticity. Your thoughts on this quick comment from this fear of future credibility and future stigma?
Yes, and thanks, Shashi, for raising it. Yeah, I call it in my book vulnerability through strength. And that's basically how I see it. You can actually turn your weaknesses into a strength if you're speaking about it. But you also need to obviously have done something about it. If you speak up, you need to be ready to take some action. And there's enough people out there, as I mentioned, so many charities, so many free volunteer organizations who are helping. And therefore, you can ask without having to expose yourself too much.
Okay, I've talked to you quite a bit. I know Andrea wants to talk a little bit about social isolation and a number of other things. So, Andrea, over to you. Nick, thank you so much. It's been, I found this very insightful and refreshing.
Thanks, Roshan.
Thanks, Roshan. All right, so yes, I have a lot of questions that I've been waiting to ask you, but as we're on the topic of vulnerability, so vulnerability is one of the topics that I'm super interested in, and I read a lot of books about it, and reading stories about people who take that step to be vulnerable. And I like that you mentioned, right, vulnerability is a strength. Contrary to what people believe it's a weakness, you're putting your reputation on the line and credibility and stuff like that. But one thing that I was thinking about when you talked about it, and even in your story and the lady in Singapore, the director, is that that the first vulnerable step they take is people who actually earn that vulnerability. For example, for you, it's your wife. For her, it's her husband, right? And then only they become vulnerable in a larger setting or the outer circle of who's closest to them. I think that's something that a lot of people don't talk about, right? People have this misconception that if I'm being vulnerable, people are gonna accept their vulnerability completely. But then, we see the stigma that comes in. People be like, we can't trust her because she's quite unstable. She's thought of suicide before, and these kind of things come out in the line. So, in that sense, what about people who do not have that closer circle? Right, like I said, they're completely alone. They don't have family, they don't have friends, they're afraid to go to a therapist. What are some of the advice would you give to them for people who are in that state?
It would depend on what problem it is. If it is like, let's give the example of if someone has a alcohol problem, for example, or they think they're drinking too much, the Alcoholics Anonymous have, for example, a 24/7 hotline which you can call for free, where you can ask some questions, so it doesn't cost any money. Uh, the second one is that you can call if someone has suicidal thoughts, for example, or if you believe that someone in your family have suicidal thoughts. There's another organization called SOS Samaritans, which also don't charge anything, and you can call them also to discuss. So that is perhaps a good starting point. And there's many more of these organizations. Again, on my website and in the book, there are some of these hotlines are there, but also from the Singapore government's, the MOM's website, you have quite a lot of these support tools. So that, I would say, is a good starting point if you don't have someone who you want to speak with.
All right, and that's great, right? We have a lot of actually free resources out there, and they use a lot of anonymity, which is really a good step for those who are really afraid to take that first step to share their story. And I think one of the comments that comes in from Sharina, she says that thanks for sharing, Nick. There's this notion that being vulnerable is only positively received when you are successful or have a successful backstory. But what about those who are always facing failure? Would them being vulnerable be received positively and be a source of inspiration for others?
Well, that's a very interesting reflection. I mean, and I don't think there's someone who's always and going through failure and always unsuccessful. I think that's a perception by the person themselves. But if someone from the outside looking at them, I believe there's a beauty and a strength in everyone. But even in a negative story, there's a learning there for the person and for others. So in the case again about that Singaporean executive, yes, she had a very successful career, and there's a learning from there. But I also seen some marvelous journeys of a lot of people recovering, people who have been struggling a lot. But it's about being around and being surrounded by these people. What is happening once you call one of the hotlines or you join one of the organizations? The next funnel can be to belong to one of the support groups, which I belong to a few at the moment, and to be around people who are discussing, how they overcame the challenges. It's a great place to be. And by constantly getting this training the muscles and the habit of being vulnerable and sharing what we're going through, it's a positive thing. But I can also recommend you to write, for example, a gratitude list every morning. If you worry about everything is just negative or failure, write every day a gratitude list. Do you have a house? Do you have food for the day? Do you have some health today? That is a successful story already. If you can go, when I was at the sickest, I couldn't walk 5 kilometers. I could hardly walk, but I managed to come up from that, and I step by step. So it's a gradual process.
All right, thank you so much, Nick. I think that's an excellent way to answer, right? That perception of failure usually comes from the person who is experiencing it rather than the outlook of it. And I think there Sashi says love it, a gratitude list. Yeah, that's something that I see a lot on Instagram. So I do a lot of social media, hence that question on community on social media. But I see a lot of people doing this, right? They every day they post a story and they share about one thing that they're grateful for. And I think that's very inspiring for the rest of us who are watching or looking at those stories. I think my next question for you would be, you talk about the five pathways. We talked about the first two, and the third one was about getting healthy. The fourth one is nurturing healthy relationships, and the last one is finding purpose. I'm very curious. In terms of having these five pathways, do they follow in an order? And if that is a yes, why is finding your purpose the last?
That's a great question there. And no, they can go in any order, but perhaps it's difficult to look for your purpose if you are extremely unwell. And if you haven't done an inventory, if you haven't fixed your health, if your brain is foggy, then finding your purpose might be difficult. So I want people first to do that inventory, to look at yourself. What is it I need to address? In my case, I needed to remove the alcohol. I needed to start eating healthier. I needed to get some sleep. Once I started to think clearer, I could then start with the next step, and that was in my case. Before finding your purpose was fix the relationships, because if you've been unwell, you might, also have taken steps away from your friends. Maybe you had snapped at your parents, or you said things that you didn't mean, but because you were not well, you didn't do the right thing. So that's means with that step to repair your broken relationship, and only when you then feel good about yourself and you really have fixed all these relationships, then you are ready to really, you feel relaxed, you can start to dig quite deep about your purpose. So these 5 steps is really for someone who is going through that recovery journey themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's excellent. The reason why I asked this was because a lot of people out there, when they talk to somebody who's struggling with some of the things that they have in their lives, right? Whether it's career, relationships, friendships, whatever it is, I often hear the advice: go and find your purpose, go and find meaning, go and find, your will to live. And that troubles me a lot, because you are basically taking all the symptoms that affect it, right? Like, for example, you say health is one, your relationships is one, the things that have been damaged in the process of you slipping down that slope is another thing to clean up before you can actually climb back up, right? And it's something that I want to also bring to an awareness for those who are watching. When somebody comes to you with that vulnerability, do you hold that space for them instead of giving them those cliche wisdom and quotes like "go find your purpose, go find your meaning"? And this is very psychological as well. In terms of like therapists out there, the first thing they do is take an inventory of where you're at, and then they give you certain drugs to treat certain symptoms that you cannot control, like for example, your chemicals in your brain, your hormones. They will treat all of that before they even sit down and, okay, now let's talk about how do you get yourself out of this. Because like you say, if your brain is foggy,
Mm.
all this finding your purpose is going to be pretty damaging, right? It's counterproductive, because then you'll be stressed out, like, I don't have a purpose in life, I don't have meaning, and then you go down that pathway again. So thank you so much for sharing on that. I think that's an excellent explanation. And I think coming back to my last question actually for you is, wow, there's a lot of help coming in on the comments, so thank you so much, Esther, for sharing that. But yes, this is a question in terms of in an organization, right? So, for example, in EGN, you're doing a peer sort of matching, right? Matching with peers that help them with these things. Do you always do it in terms of like that matching doesn't happen within an organization? Or can it be within an organization? And if that happens, how do you not jeopardize the relationships or the dynamics in an organization? For example, if we're gonna have my CEO, which is Roshan, right, match with me, and we talk about the things that we're going through in life, how do we manage those kind of expectations and not blur boundaries in terms of workplaces? I'm very curious in terms of how you do that.
So what we do, Andrea, is that we organize peer groups which would be external of your company. So you wouldn't get anyone from your own organization to join the same peer group. So we have 30, 35 peers in the group, each led with a moderator, and you meet every second month for 4 hours. Then there's in between communication as well, but those are the main sessions, so 6 per year. And the whole point is that you shouldn't have anyone from your company in there. This should be your own sort of private space. Everyone have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, so you should feel that you can open up and speak openly about your work-related challenges and so on. So in that sense, we don't match you with peers inside the organization. And if someone want to join us, the first thing we do is looking at their profile and asking them some questions, and then we profile them in one of our groups.
And usually, are they on the same level? For example, if they're all C-suites, then you match with C-suites, because then they can share their experiences at the same level.
Correct, and we have other groups for example, SMEs, business owners. Then, depending on that, we have a group for small business owners and one and other for medium. So the point is that when you come in there, you should feel that you are around like-minded people, so you have the connection, you understand each other, and that is again what we started to talk about today. Is about how to overcome loneliness. Is to feel the connection, to feel that you can be around people who understand you and you speak the same language.
All right, I think that's excellent. I think I would end with one final quote, and of course your final thoughts on this, Nick. I think this quote is by Brene Brown, one of my favorite authors as well, and she's a sociologist, and she talks a lot about vulnerability and shame, right? Shame resilience specifically. So she says that our fight or flight strategies are effective for survival, not for reasoning or connection. And the pain or shame is enough to trigger that survival part of our brain that runs, hides, or comes out swinging. I think this is an excellent quote because it tells you that when people feel lonely, there's always an underlying reason to it. It's not just suddenly pops out of nowhere and you feel lonely completely. It usually is gradual, things that happen. You don't feel connected, you don't find connection with others. And then that kind of shame brings it even worse, right? You hide, you run, or you lash out. So I think that's my final quote for the day. What are your final thoughts, Nick, on this topic?
No, I think it's a wonderful quote, and obviously I agree with it. And I just want to say that yes, it can be that we have lost the connections, that we don't feel the connection with them for since we don't speak the same language. But it can equally be that that your brain is foggy, that perhaps you taking some medicine or drugs or alcohol or using something like that, which also makes you not being healthy enough. So then you don't even feel the connection with yourself, and therefore you don't feel the connection with others. And that is where and what we've been talking about today, and how to overcome this.
All right. And speaking of connection, Nick, how can our audience connect with you?
That would be on LinkedIn. You can follow me or send me a connection of LinkedIn. I share quite a lot in regards to loneliness on my profile. So I'm looking forward to remaining in touch with all of you.
All right. So thank you so much once again, Nick, for joining with us. And we're going to put in some articles for those who want to read a bit more about executive loneliness and a book. If you want to purchase it, go ahead and do that. And I think one last thing I would point out is a comment, the last comment on the section, right? Says that Shavina, great question. Was thinking about this earlier today, especially if you're not as crucial or important to the future of a company. So for those who are watching this, if you feel that way, know that you are not alone. There are many people who feel like you. The question is now, how do you overcome it? Where do you find your community and your connection once again? And what are the things that you need to do to, overcome that loneliness, whether or not you are important or what you deem as non-important to the company? I think there's always ways to look at it. So thank you once again, everybody who's joined us. Thank you so much, Nick. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week for another topic, and all the best with your journey to overcoming your loneliness. All right. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.